Thanks for staying with Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, with me, Sharaad Kuttan. Today, Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad launched the Foreign Policy Framework for Malaysia Baru, a living document, he says, which captures the essence of the foreign policy direction of the current administration. Now, joining us on the line to help us better understand this framework, we have Datuk Saifuddin Abdullah, the Foreign Minister of Malaysia. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, Datuk. Now, my first question to you is that there's an overarching theme of this framework. It's called change in continuity. Now, what exactly does change in continuity mean for Malaysia's foreign policy?
Well, number one, in foreign policy, you cannot tell people that we have a totally new foreign policy. Then your telephone will not stop ringing. Everybody will ask you, is Palestine still on the agenda? Is Rohingya still on the agenda? Are you going to be pro-West or pro-East and so on? So, as far as our foreign policy is concerned, what is meant by continuity is that the principles, the basic fundamentals of foreign policy, for example, ASEAN remain the cornerstone of our foreign policy. We want to be friendly with all nations. We want to trade with all nations. We remain a member of non-aligned movement. Palestine is always on the agenda. So these basic things will not change. What is then the change? The change is about new approaches. We may have a new focus. We may revisit some old focus and bring a new, new values into it or new elements into it. So, for example, we used to have Look East policy, now it's Look East policy 2.0. What is another change would be we want to be more proactive in decision-making processes so that, for example, while we are a member of the UN Security Council, we are very active on certain international issues. While we are not, we seem to be not active. Now we are saying, even if we are not a member of the UN Security Council, it does not mean that we will not play as active role as at a time when we are a member of the UN Security Council, and there are many ways of making our voices heard.
Doctor, I want to ask you, the Prime Minister today, when he made the announcement, mentioned Palestine. He also mentioned Jammu and Kashmir, but he did not mention the Uyghurs of China. This signal that in some ways realpolitik will continue to dominate the way Malaysia articulates global issues because we are a small and middling power.
Well, what we are doing is we are looking at cases, at issues case by case. We have been very vocal on the issue of Palestine and Rohingya, yes. Now, even on the issue of Rohingya, we are now saying that 20 years ago, if we were to understand the Rohingya issue properly, or rather, let's put it this way, if we were to understand Rohingya better 20 years ago, we would probably have taken a different approach to the Rohingya issue. What we are doing now is we are treating Rohingya issue just like we treat Palestine, whereas the two are not necessarily the same. And that is why on Jammu, Kashmir, we have a certain way of looking at it, and slightly different than how we treat Rohingya issue.
All right. So in the press conference earlier as well, Dr. Saifuddin, the Prime Minister signalled a consultative approach to developing foreign policy. Can you help us elaborate? What does he mean by this consultative approach?
Okay, there are three things here. Number one, this idea about the new framework, even though it is something that we launched during our time in our administration, but I must tell you, it did not start from zero. Even before, in the previous administration, there was a paper prepared by ISIS. ISIS happened to be one of the institutions under Wisma Putra. Unfortunately, that paper was not given due recognition by the past administration. We look at the paper again. We took a lot of it. Some of the ideas that were launched today came from that paper. And that paper was produced by about 50 who's who in Malaysian foreign policy, former diplomats, former ministers, and so on. Number two, on my part, I formed the Foreign Policy Consultative Council of Wisma Putra. We had thorough discussion on this, and besides that, I conducted town hall meetings and consultation with CSOs, with the youth organization, and so on. And number three, as we implement our foreign policy framework, we will continue engaging with the civil society, with the private sector, and this is what PM meant by we are taking a consultative and participatory approach in the planning and also in the implementation of our foreign policy.
Okay, the last minute we have, Dato', very quickly, critics have noted that Malaysian foreign policy is often shaped by the views of one man, Dr. Mahathir himself, that he has his idiosyncrasies. The fact that he announced it, not you as the foreign minister, was that significant?
Two things here. Number one, many policies are announced by the Prime Minister, number one. Number two, in any country, in most cases, when the head of government and the head of state choose to play an active role in foreign policy, then the head of state or the head of government has a lot of influence on the foreign policy framework, the way it is run in any given country. And this is nothing new. And in my case, I think this is very helpful. It's not, you see, in ASEAN, for example, not every head of government or head of state wants to play an active role. The fact that you have the Prime Minister who wants to play an active role, I can tell you it helps a lot, and it gives us a lot of, it opens a lot of windows, especially in the region.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us, Dr. Saifuddin. Now, joining us on the line, we also have someone from ISIS, from the Institute of Strategic and International Studies. We have Bunn Nagara, who is a senior fellow there. Thank you for joining us today, Bunn. I'd like to begin with getting your thoughts again on the overarching theme. This change in continuity feels a bit like an oxymoron to me, but what do you think?
Well, the way I read it, it's basically maintaining the broad themes as before, but perhaps with certain tweaks and certain emphases or updates where useful or necessary. For example, major themes like championing the sovereign rights of developing countries, of maintaining ASEAN centrality in regional affairs, of also underlining ASEAN's purpose in the region as a core player in Southeast Asia, and working with any friendly country that is favorably disposed to work with us. These are the I think, central themes that will remain largely unchanged, whereas there may be some changes in, for example, greater focus on issues of foreign policy concern to make, better value for money for Malaysia. As you know, budgeting is a major issue for us now, and also to be more transparent and accountable in terms of foreign policy expenditure. In addition, I think some changes may come in the way of, to be more wary of major power or superpower interests that may not align with ours, and also to be more careful in general about the fallout from major power conflict, whether it's between the U.S. and China, or the U.S. and Russia, or between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or among certain Arab countries that may not agree with one another. We should not be drawn into any of this unnecessarily, and we have to actually make stretch our buck to make sure that we get value for money in foreign policy issues.
But if I could ask you precisely about the question of a superpower rivalry in the South China Sea, for instance, is there any other way for Malaysia to play this game? It is a game in which China is demanding loyalty from its so-called allies or people it associates with, and America as well. Is there room to maneuver for a country as small as Malaysia?
Yes, but I think a limited room, but still we have to make the most of it. We are a non-aligned country to begin with, and therefore is neutrality, but I think more than just neutrality, not passive neutrality, but an active one, in trying to emphasize, I think, the positive aspects of what we can do in being an honest broker between the major powers. I think we should not imagine that we can do very much, but at the same time, we have to do the most that we can. The first thing, I think, is not to be drawn in by one side or the other. Secondly, to emphasize what can be done in a very moderate way that, can help to heal, negative relations among the bigger powers, and also to get the other ASEAN countries, as far as possible, to work together as one. The U.S. has or had only a couple of allies in the region. Philippines and Thailand in Southeast Asia were the countries where they had or had a major military bases. And China itself doesn't really have any allies, strictly speaking. Cambodia and Laos have sometimes been called allies, but actually they are not necessarily going to go with China or anyone else all the way either.
But I wonder if we could take a look back, a historical perspective. Now, we mentioned earlier that critics of Dr. Mahathir say that foreign policy has really been dominated by Mahathir's idiosyncrasies. Now, I'm just wondering, what do you think Malaysia foreign policy is going to be like under Dr. Mahathir's second time around, Malaysia Baru, with this framework?
Well, I think this time around there's more inclusiveness in the process. In fact, the new foreign policy framework has been the work of a group of various stakeholders in Malaysia. And it has taken several years to evolve, and it has come to this stage where I think we are in a better position now than before. There's been definitely more inclusiveness than before among Malaysians, Malaysian players and stakeholders. And we have to accept also that whether it's the Prime Minister of a country or the President of a country, the leader actually makes the policy with consultations from the cabinet, in varying degrees, of course, from country to country. But, it is the leader, whether as Prime Minister or President, who makes the ultimate decisions.
All right, thank you so much for speaking with us, Bunn. Now, we'll be back with more on Consider This. Stay with us.